There are certain mornings a man carries inside him for the rest of his days. Not the loud ones, not the mornings of gunfire or flood or fire, though Lord knows I've had my share of those too. No, I mean the quiet ones, the ones that arrive without announcement and leave you changed in ways you don't fully understand, until you're old enough to look back and name what happened. That winter morning in the Wyoming Territory, in the year of our Lord, 1883, was one such morning for me. We had been on the homestead claim for going on 3 years by then, 96 acres of high meadow country south of Laramie, where the wind never truly stopped, and the sky sat so low in November, you felt you could reach up and drag your fingers through the clouds. We had built the cabin ourselves, she and I, log by fitted log, daubing the gaps with river clay and dry grass against the cold. We had dug the root cellar by hand. We had strung the fence line. We had done everything two people can do with rope and mule and stubbornness and not enough sleep, and the place had come to look like something worth defending. She was the one who had insisted on the goat. I remember the afternoon she brought it home from the Hendersons' place, tied to the back of our wagon with a length of good cotton rope, its black and white coat catching the October light in a way that made it look almost painted. It was a small animal, Nubian stock, with those long folded ears and those pale, strange eyes that always seemed to be thinking of something over. The men at the feed store had laughed at her for it. Goats were poor man's livestock, they said. Scavengers, fence wreckers, nuisances. A proper rancher kept cattle and horses. A proper rancher did not come home with a spotted goat on the end of a rope and call it wisdom. She had said nothing to any of them. She rarely did when her mind was made up. She had read somewhere, one of those agricultural circulars she ordered by post and kept stacked beside the stove, that the milk of the Nubian goat was richer than cow's milk, easier on a weak stomach, with properties that older healers in other countries had trusted for generations. I had listened to her explain it and nodded the way a man does when he understands he is outnumbered by someone smarter than himself. We named the goat Nothing. She said naming a working animal was asking for attachment that made hard decisions harder. But I noticed she scratched behind those long ears every morning. The goat had given us milk all through November and into December, mild and sweet, and I had taken to drinking a cup of it cold before heading out to the barn each day. And then December turned hard, and then she fell ill. And on that quiet Wyoming morning I am telling you about, I woke beside her and found her burning. Her skin was the color of candle wax and hot to the touch, the way iron gets hot near a forge, not the ordinary warmth of a body working through a night chill, but something deeper, something that felt like it was coming from the bones themselves. I put my hand against her cheek and held it there, and even half asleep she turned her face into my palm the way she always did. That small, unconscious gesture she probably didn't know she made. It undid me every time. It undid me now in a way that had nothing sweet in it. I dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp. I didn't want to wake her, and I think I was also afraid of what I might see in better light. I pulled on my coat and my boots, and I went to the window first, the way I always did before heading out, to check the sky and get a sense of what the day intended. What I saw was snow, not falling yet, but loaded in the clouds. That particular flat gray ceiling that a man learns to read after enough Wyoming winters. It would come before noon, maybe before 9. I went out to the barn and did the morning feeding with my mind only partly on the work. The horses ate. The two remaining hens moved around in their dim corner. And the goat, that long-eared, spotted, ridiculous goat, stood in her small pen and regarded me with those pale, strange eyes that always looked like they were waiting for me to say something intelligent. I milked her. I did it because it was the morning routine and because my hands needed something to do while my head worked. The milk came warm into the pail, steaming faintly in the cold air of the barn, and I watched it and thought about her. She had been off her food since Sunday. I had thought it was the cold snap. Thought maybe she'd caught a chill drying her hair too close to the window after washing it. But Sunday's tiredness had become Monday's heaviness, and Monday's heaviness had become Tuesday's fever, and now it was Wednesday, and the fever had climbed past anything I could explain away. The nearest doctor was in Laramie, 22 miles east, and those 22 miles were about to disappear under a foot of snow. I carried the milk back to the house in the small covered pail we kept for the purpose. I set it on the stove to take the worst of the chill off. Not to boil it, she had told me once, because boiling changed something in it. And I stood there watching the thin curl of steam rise from under the lid and thought about what she would tell me to do if she were standing beside me, healthy and clear-headed instead of burning in the next room. She would have known. She always knew. She had a way of reading a situation, reading land, reading weather, reading animals and people, that I had stopped trying to understand and simply learned to trust. I poured a small cup and carried it to her. She was lying on her side when I came in, which was better than the flat-on-her-back stillness I'd found her in that morning. The lamp on the windowsill threw a thin yellow light across the quilt, and I could see the damp where the fever had worked through the fabric. I pulled the chair close and sat down with the cup in both hands, letting the warmth of it pass into my palms. "Can you hear me?" I said. Her eyes didn't open, but her lips moved. That was enough. I dipped my finger into the milk and touched it to the corner of her mouth, the way I'd once seen her do with a kid goat that had been born too weak to stand. She had sat in the barn for 2 hours that night, patiently coaxing the little animal, and I had stood in the doorway, watching, and thought that patience like that was a kind of devotion most people never get to witness. Now I understood what she had been practicing for, though I wouldn't have said it that way then. She took the moisture from my finger without waking. I waited. Then I did it again. I don't know how many times I repeated that small motion before her swallowing. Reflex answered it reliably, but by the time the lamp needed trimming, the cup was half gone, and she had not turned away from it once. That meant something. An animal in true distress stops accepting nourishment. She was still fighting, somewhere beneath that terrible heat, and whatever part of her was still clear-headed enough to fight had decided the milk was worth keeping down. I trimmed the lamp. I fed the stove. I went back to her side. Sometime near what I guessed was midnight, the wind changed direction and the snow that had been threatening all day finally committed itself. I could hear it against the north wall of the cabin, a low, persistent hiss, and the temperature inside dropped enough that I pulled the second quilt from the chest at the foot of the bed and laid it over her without disturbing her. She was still hot to the touch, but the heat felt different to me. Or maybe I was only desperate enough to imagine it did. I refilled the cup from the pail on the stove. She was a woman who made her decisions carefully and her judgments precisely. and she had looked at that spotted goat on a cold morning 3 years before and said, without any drama, that she intended to keep it. People in town had smiled at that. I had smiled at that. The goat was small and odd-looking and produced milk in quantities that seemed barely worth the effort of the pail. But she had seen something in it that the rest of us had missed, because that was what she did. She saw past the surface of a thing to whatever was true underneath. I sat with that thought and with the cup in my hand and listened to the snow work against the cabin walls. And I told myself I was going to trust her judgment one more time. I dipped a clean cloth into the milk and pressed it to her lips the way I had the first time, slow and deliberate, watching for the small motion of her swallowing. It was there, faint, but there. I counted each one like a man counting coins he cannot afford to lose. 4 swallows, then 5. Then she turned her head a degree to one side, and her breathing shifted into something slower and more even, and I sat back in the chair and let out a breath I had been holding for what felt like hours. The snow had not let up. I could hear it in the way the wind moved around the corners of the cabin, that particular low hum that came when the drifts were banking up against the foundation logs. There would be no going out before morning and no one coming in. It was only the two of us, the stove, the lamp, and the milk still warm in the pail. I thought about what the doctor had said. I had replayed it a dozen times in the hours since I rode back from town, each time hearing it a little differently. He had not been unkind exactly. He was a man of learning, and he believed in what he knew, which I could not entirely fault him for. But there had been something in the way he said it, something that carried the particular weight of a man who has never once had to ask himself whether he might be wrong. Barnyard foolishness, he had called it. He had said it the way a man says a thing he expects will end the conversation. It had not ended anything. It had only sent me back out into the cold with the decision already made. I got up and added a length of pine to the stove and checked that the damper was set right for a long, slow burn. The cabin was small enough that it held heat well when the wood was good, and I had split enough in the fall that the stack under the lean-to would last us through any storm this season had to offer. She had pressed me to finish that woodpile early, back in September when the weather was still agreeable. She had a way of thinking ahead that I admired and sometimes, in weaker moments, resented because it meant she was almost always right. I went back to the chair and looked at her face. The color was still too high, still that burning flush across her cheekbones that had frightened me 2 days ago when it first came on. But her lips were no longer cracked the way they had been that morning, and her hands, resting open on the quilt, had lost a little of their rigid stillness. They looked, to me, like the hands of a woman who was sleeping, rather than the hands of a woman who was being taken from somewhere. I picked up the cloth again. I dipped it, and I waited. And when she turned faintly toward the touch, I gave her more, as careful and patient as a man watering a seedling in dry ground. Sometime past midnight, when the wind had settled into that low, steady moan that meant it had found its direction and intended to keep it, I heard the goat. She was in the small shed attached to the east wall of the barn, the shed I had built in October with lumber from the mill in town, and she did not usually make a sound at night. She was not that kind of animal. She had come to us the previous spring when my wife had traded 2 laying hens and a sack of dried beans for her at the Brennan place, and from the first day she had been a quiet, deliberate creature who seemed to understand that noise cost something. But that night she called out, once, clearly, and then again, and I sat up from the chair and listened. It was not distress. I had learned the difference by then. It was more like an announcement. I do not know what moved me to go to her. Maybe it was simply that I needed to move, that the sitting and the watching and the careful rationing of hope had grown too heavy to hold still beneath. I pulled on my coat and boots and took the lantern from the hook by the door, and I crossed the yard in the dark and the cold, the snow packed hard under my boots, the stars very clear above in the way they only get when the temperature is dropped serious and low. She was standing when I came in, which was not unusual, but her eyes caught the lantern light in that gold way they had, and she put her nose toward me with a patience that felt, in that particular moment, like something close to kindness. I had milked her that morning. I had done it because it needed doing, because she needed the relief of it, and because my wife had always done it herself, and I did not want the rhythm of the place to come apart any further than it already had. But I had not thought much beyond the act itself. I had set the pail in the cold corner of the kitchen and gone back to the room where she lay. Now I stood in the shed with the lantern, and I thought about what she had told me more than once in the kind of quiet, certain voice she used when she was not arguing but simply stating something she knew to be true. The goat's milk is different, she had said. Sits easier. It does something the other doesn't. I had nodded the way a man nods when he is listening but not quite believing. She had more patience for that kind of knowledge than I did. The old ways, the things her grandmother had said, the remedies that did not come from any bottle the doctor carried in his black bag. I respected her for it even when I did not follow her there. I looked at the goat. The goat looked at me. I picked up the small pail from its nail on the post, and I sat down on the milking stool and I began. The milking did not take long. She had always said the goat gave more than you expected for her size, and that night I understood what she meant. The pail filled to a good measure without the animal fussing or stepping sideways. She stood still in a way that almost seemed deliberate, as if she understood the hour and the weight of it. I am not a man who assigns feelings to animals where none belong, but I will say that goat was steady and cooperative in a way I was grateful for, and I did not examine it further than that. I carried the pail back inside and set it on the stove, not to boil it. I remembered her saying that heat changed it, that you wanted it warm the way it came, not cooked. So I kept the flame low and held my hand near the surface until it felt right. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, and the lamp cast a yellow circle that barely reached the corners of the room. She was the same when I went back to her, breathing, but barely present. Her lips were cracked and the skin at her temples looked too thin, the way paper looks when it has been wetted and dried too many times. I brought a clean cloth and a small tin cup I had warmed by setting it near the stove. I dipped the corner of the cloth into the milk and I pressed it gently to her lips. Nothing happened the first time. The second time, I thought I saw the faintest movement of her throat, the suggestion of a swallow that might have been nothing at all. The third time, I was certain. Small. Barely there, but certain. I worked slowly. A dipped cloth, a press of it to her lips, a long wait. The fire popped behind me. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the eaves in that low, tunneling sound that meant the cold was settling in for the night. I did not look at the window. I kept my eyes on her face, and I kept wetting the cloth and pressing it to her lips and waiting. At some point, I began to talk, not about anything in particular. I told her about the fence post that had heaved up on the south side, the one I had been meaning to reset for 2 weeks. I told her the mare had been favoring her left foreleg, and I intended to check it in the morning. I told her the woodpile was holding, and she would not need to worry about that. I told her ordinary things, the way you tell a person the ordinary things of a day to remind them there is still a day to return to. The cup was half empty. I did not know how much of it had reached her and how much had simply dampened the cloth and the bedding. I only knew I would not stop. I would fill the cup again when it was empty, and I would fill it again after that. Her face had not changed, but I stayed. The lamp burned low sometime past midnight, and I rose to trim the wick without letting go of the thought I had been holding, that if I kept my mind steady, somehow she would too. It is a foolish thing to believe that your own stillness can anchor another person's spirit to this world. But a man alone in a room with someone he loves will believe many things he would not speak aloud in daylight. I filled the cup again from the small crock I had set beside the stove. The milk was cool now, no longer warm from the goat's body, but it had not soured. I carried it back and sat down and began again the slow, careful work of the cloth. A few drops at a time, pressing the wetted linen to the seam of her lips and waiting for her throat to move. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. I counted the times it did and let go of the times it did not. The wind had dropped. That surprised me when I noticed it. The cabin had a particular sound when the wind came from the north, a low, steady pulling at the eave boards. And now that sound was gone, and in its place was only the tick of the stove cooling and the soft labor of her breathing. Her breathing had not changed in its pace, but I told myself I believed, that it had changed in its depth, that each breath drew down a little further than the last. I talked again when the silence grew too large. I told her about the goat. I had never much cared for the animal, and she knew it, and I told her so plainly, speaking to her the way you speak to someone who can hear everything and is simply choosing to rest. I told her the goat had eaten through the lower rail of the pen gate in September, and I had repaired it with a length of chain, which was not elegant, but had held. I told her I had been wrong to argue against keeping it. Not the first time I had been wrong. Probably not the last. She was better at knowing what a thing was worth than I was, and I was learning to admit that, even if I admitted it slowly. I set down the cup and smoothed the quilt across her shoulders. The fever was still there when I laid my hand to her forehead, still present, still holding her somewhere between here and wherever the fever takes a person. But it did not seem to be climbing. That was what I told myself, that it had stopped climbing and was simply resting at its height, the way a flood sits at its crest before it begins, in its own time, to recede. I did not know if that was true. I knew almost nothing for certain in that room except that I was there and she was there, and I was not going to move from that chair until something changed. The night stretched on around us. The hours between midnight and first light are the longest hours a man will ever know. I had sat through long nights before, calving season, a prairie fire threatening the east fence line. The winter, our well froze 3 days running, and I hauled water by lantern from the creek a quarter-mile distant. I knew how to sit still and wait. But those other nights had something to do with my hands. There was always a task. Here there was nothing to do but watch her breathe and listen to the wind work itself along the eaves and count the small sounds of the house settling into the cold. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, I fell into something that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. A gray, in-between place where I could still hear the lamp wick burning and still feel the weight of the chair beneath me, but where time moved strangely and without purpose. I came back to myself sharply when she stirred. It was only a small movement. She turned her head on the pillow, a slight shifting, the way a person repositions in sleep. But it brought me upright in the chair, and my hand was on hers before I had thought to reach for it. Her skin felt different. I sat very still and tried to decide if I was imagining what I thought I felt. A man who wants something badly enough will sometimes feel it before it is real, will convince himself of what he hopes rather than what is. I knew that. I pressed the back of my hand carefully against her cheek, the way she had shown me to do when checking whether bread dough had risen to the right warmth. The heat was still there, but it had shifted. Where before it had been a dry, pressing, relentless thing. The kind of heat that feels like it has taken up permanent residence. This was something softer, something that had lost its certainty. I sat back and breathed. I refilled the cup from the jar I had left on the bedside table and waited to see if she would stir again. The goat was quiet in the pen outside. The whole yard was quiet. Even the wind had dropped to something low and almost gentle, moving through the grass with less conviction than it had shown at dusk. I thought about the way she had looked at that goat the morning we first brought it home. There had been something in her expression that I had not fully understood at the time. Not just satisfaction at a good trade, but something deeper, a quiet confidence in her own judgment, in her own knowing. She had not argued the point with anyone, including me. She had simply kept the animal and let time do the explaining. That was a quality I had spent years trying to learn and still did not possess the way she possessed it. The patience to be right without announcement. The willingness to wait. I set the cup close to her hand and settled back into the chair to keep my watch. The night moved the way nights do when you're keeping watch over someone you love. In long, uneven stretches that feel nothing like sleep and nothing like waking, but some country in between where the mind works without your permission and the body forgets to be comfortable. I had stopped counting the hours somewhere before midnight. The lamp had burned low and I had trimmed it twice, and now it gave just enough light to see her face and the slow rise and fall of her chest, which was all I needed to see. Sometime in those deep hours, she moved her hand. Not toward me, not reaching for anything in particular, just a small unconscious shift, the way a person adjusts in ordinary sleep. But it was the first time she had moved of her own will since the fever had taken her hard, and I sat forward in the chair and watched and said nothing, afraid that even breath might interrupt whatever quiet process was at work inside her. Her color was different. I do not know how else to say it. The fever flush had been a particular kind of red, high and dry and wrong, the color of effort rather than health. What I was seeing now in that trimmed lamplight was something less violent. She was pale, yes, but it was a softer pale, a resting pale, the difference between a field after a fire and a field after snow, both stripped bare, but one promising nothing and the other promising spring. I reached out and laid the back of my hand against her forehead, the way she had taught me to, early in our years together, when she first explained that the palm reads what it hopes, and the back of the hand reads what is true. She had learned it from her mother. I had never forgotten it. The skin was damp, cool, or near enough to cool to matter. I stayed very still for a moment. Then I went to the window and looked out at the pen, though I do not know what I expected to find there. The goat standing in the dark, watching the house, waiting for word, some creature's version of what I was doing inside. I could not see clearly, but I could hear her, a low, settled sound, the sound of an animal comfortable in its place. It was, in its way, steadying. I came back to the chair and sat down and folded my hands in my lap. I had been talking to myself for most of the night in the way a man does when he has no one to talk to and too much pressing on him. Partial sentences, half-formed thanks, bargains offered to no one in particular. Now I was quiet. There was nothing left to bargain with. The work had been done, or it had not. The milk had reached her, or it had not. The knowing she had carried about that animal had been right, or it had been only stubbornness, and morning would settle the question in its own time. I watched her breathe and waited for the light to change. The light changed slowly, the way it does in autumn when the sun has not yet committed to the day, and the sky holds a long gray pause before deciding. I watched the window. I watched her. I had done both all night and could not have said which one I was really watching. Whether I was looking for the morning or for some sign in her face that the morning had already made its decision without consulting me. She moved first. Not much. A settling, a small turn of the head on the pillow. The kind of motion that means nothing in a sleeping person, but means everything in one who has been still too long. I sat forward in the chair. I set my hands on my knees. I did not speak. I was afraid to speak, the way a man is afraid to move when a bird has landed near him, and he does not want to startle it away. Her eyes opened, not all at once, the way eyes open when the body is remembering how. And they were not clear at first, clouded, uncertain, moving without purpose across the ceiling, the way a person does when they are not yet sure where they are, or what year it is, or how they came to be lying down. But then they moved. They found the window. They found the gray light coming through it. And then, slowly, they found me. I could not say a word. There was nothing in me that had any words left. I put my hand over hers where it lay on the quilt and I held it. Her fingers moved. She pressed back, only a little, but she pressed back, and that small pressure was the whole of everything. She did not speak for a long while. Neither did I. We stayed like that in the gray morning while the light gathered itself and the stove ticked quietly. And somewhere outside the goat made her low, settled sound, steady and unhurried, as though she had always known this was how the night would end. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough and thin, but it was hers. She asked if the goat had been tended to. I laughed. I could not help it. I put my head down and laughed the way a man laughs when the relief is too large for any other expression. And then I told her yes. The goat had been tended to. The goat was fine. The goat was better than either of us in all likelihood. She smiled at that. Small and tired, but real. I never told the doctor what had turned the fever. There was no point in it. He was a man with a fixed idea of how things worked, and no outcome was going to change that. I understood it. I had met the same fixed idea in myself more than once, about more than one thing, and I had been wrong in the same confident way. She was right. About the goat. About a great many things. I have not forgotten it.